If the warnings of the International Monetary Fund is to be considered by China, their huge reliance on debt will create for them a new financial problem. Despite the increase in credit risks, Chinese real growth has been shifting between 1 to 2% in the last 3 years. What they are doing is just like the former Soviet Union, fabricating numbers. Using energy utilization as a measure of economic growth, it is pegged at 1%. As a hyper-welfare state economy, what China is forgetting to consider is the absence of any proven welfare state-driven economy globally. Even though China is being touted as a success by globalists, there are many indices of a failed or failing economy. In the coming years, this is what will happen. China's debt is like a bubble, and it will burst, leaving a negative impact on its economy. What they are doing in the short term by writing off this debt will draw the Chinese economy into a zero growth period, something similar to Japan's lost decades. As a communist economy, everything is within the ambit of the government. This means the nation has the excesses not available to most nations. However, this is not expected to last, as the laws of economics will take over and lead to the end. Not that this has not happened before, but it has actually happened twice. But the government magically saved the economy. Majorly, China has usually put debt into properties. This is caused by the growing inflation by the PBOC, which made property investment the new gold rush. The new investment into ghost cities are not inhabitable for humans. In a few years of development, they have become a danger to its inhabitants. In the end, ghost cities will become nothing but rubble and will force investors into further debts, as they'll be unable to service their debts. Being an inflationary debt, real wealth is being tied down from productive utilization. The outcome is quite predictable, however. There will not be a way to pay for the unproductive debts. At this rate, China is headed for a disaster when the debt bubble pops, and it will. China only got to where it is due to being a dumping ground for multi-billion-dollar corporations. There's no room for SMEs, leaving no space for sustainable growth. When the bubble pops, Chinese middle class will bear most of the brunt. They won't be along. Those who invested into this elephant project will be there. Of course, the Chinese government will strive to cover up the mess by monetizing it, leading to hyperinflation. China's debt bubble leaves everyone in a dilemma, being the second largest economy. Looking at this from the angle of statistics, China's debt has gone from 156% to 317% of their GDP between 2008 and 2018. If shadow banking debts are factors, we'll be looking at 400% of GDP. From this number, 190% is traceable to Chinese state-run enterprises. This is unlike what is obtainable in the United States, where 70% of debts is linked to U.S. corporations. What the Chinese leadership is doing is to use state-run enterprises to accumulate debts, rather than the People's Bank of China. What we have in China is double of what is even an excessive standard in Western nations for corporate debt. What is now the poser is this: how profitable are these Chinese state-run enterprises to service these mountains of debt? What's likely to happen is that public funds will eventually be used in servicing these debts to keep them in business. So, why has China more than doubled its debt in 10 years as a percentage of GDP, but quadrupled the monetary figure, from a low figure of $6 trillion in 2008 to $29 trillion in 2018? This is a total debt, which includes private and government, an expansion of $23 million in debt in just 10 years. During the same period, U.S. consumers only added $1.8 trillion in debt, a The percentage of GDP fell some 20% as U.S. consumers deleveraged after the GFC and rebuilt their bank balances. The U.S. government also spent around $8 trillion in debt and other measures over the 10 years to manage the effects of the GFC and fund government spending, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Even including that, U.S. corporate debt has doubled to be at present $6.1 trillion. At this figure, many experts in the U.S. are talking about a U.S. corporate debt bubble at just 30% of GDP. So what will a figure of 190% of GDP for China's state enterprise do to public finances? China in 2017, GDP was $12.2 trillion. 190% of this means China's entire state-run enterprises are holding debt of some $22 trillion US dollars, or more than the entire federal government debt of the USA. This figure helps to explain how China financed its GDP expansions from 2008 to 2018 without a corresponding increase in national debt held by the People's Bank of China. Most of the debt was accumulated in state-run enterprises to provide the GDP growth for China's economy. Let's recap and focus on these figures. $22 trillion US dollars in debt is held by Chinese state-run enterprises. This is just one sector of China's economy. China's household debt increased from 44.8% of GDP in January 2017 to 53.2% of GDP in October of 2017. That's an 8.4% increase in debt to GDP in just 9 months. Household debt stands at $6.5 trillion. Chinese government debt of 48% of GDP is about $6 trillion. So all up, China is holding about $35 trillion of debt that we know of at present, with an economy of $12.2 trillion. The U.S. with $20 trillion of federal debt, the household debt of $13.3 trillion, corporate debt of $6.1 trillion, total $39.4 trillion. I'm not going to go into state, province, or local government debts. A lot of this would be double counting. But look, the problem is obvious. China has around 300% of debt to GDP, with a nation still developing and a middle class on $15,000 per year income. Such high debt levels make it very difficult, if not impossible, for China to make the jump from a high-income economy. The debt trap, like many prior to China, will derail its economy, which will reduce incomes and lead to a contraction in GDP growth. The U.S. has debts of around 200% of GDP. However, it has a high-income consumer base of over $60,000 projected for 2018, developed financial markets with a mature economy and services. If China continues in the lane of doubling its debt as a percentage of GDP as it did in the last 10 years, it is heading for the rocks. Based on the current trends, China would need to target around 500% to 600% debts as a percentage of GDP. However, this is unattainable as both the world market and China's internal markets cannot accommodate it. What's now likely to happen if debts are turned off? This will curtail the growth to 5.7% from 20.9% it has been. 1 year's reduction will bring about a 1% reduction in the growth of GDP. Reducing state enterprises will also lead to another 2% to 3% decrease in GDP. In the end, China might experience zero GDP growth if consumer spending, especially in the real estate, comes into the mix. This is the dilemma that's worrying the CCP leadership. All of this will lead to panicking in China, from the businesses to even down to consumers. When this happens, world market will react and bring about a massive capital flight and further leads to liquidity issues in China. To curtail these effects, China would have no choice than to put it up foreign reserves for sale. As expected, even the proceeds for the sale will be unable to cushion the effect of the capital flight and liquidity problems to be faced. We're talking about just $3 trillion of foreign reserves that you're unlikely to get the actual value from the sales. This will lead to China running at a loss if the reserves are sold over a short-term period. The foreign reserve might provide an immediate succor, but for the current size of the Chinese economy, it will be a drop in the ocean. There's also, of course, a trade war with the US, and its negative effects would compound this situation. The only available option for China is to fashion a new, sustainable way of combating the debt problems. This will require a top-to-bottom restructuring of the economy. This will mean that the state-run enterprises would be allowed to fail. The government has the option of buying them and adopting the route the US took in nationalizing and selling the auto industry. A non-viable route will be seizing the enterprises, but it would create newer problems by destroying what's left of the fate of due process and ease of doing business in China. In all of these, the state would resort to more debt in order to save the economy from total collapse, which will lead to depression. Another angle will be the Chinese yuan. It will be affected in all of this and bring about capital flight. There is a likelihood of social unrest also, as the people will be unable to access and move their investments. Regardless of the route considered, it'll still spiral out of control. What China is doing to solve their problem is by borrowing money every time, and that cannot continue to sustain them in the long term. They'll soon find themselves at a breaking point.